What's up, guys? Calendros here. So this is going to be my review for Final Fantasy VII Remake. So before we get into the actual review, this is going to be done in a somewhat different way, I think, than probably most people would handle it, just because of the nature of the game. I'm going to be basically splitting the video up into three sections by timestamps. So, first part of the video is going to be a non-spoiler review, and then we're going to go into spoilers for the actual game itself. Final Fantasy VII Remake. And then the final section will be spoilers for the overall world of Final Fantasy VII, the Final Fantasy VII cinematic universe, if you want to call it that, And because I realized that there was a lot of people who are new to the series and started with Final Fantasy VII Remake and have not played the original, haven't played Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus, or maybe even watched Advent Children Complete. So, with that said, there is a couple things that I want to say that are really, really, really important. Okay? Let me turn the music down slightly. As great as the music is. Okay. So, here's the thing. It's not like imperative, but I would say that it's really important if you want to get as much as possible out of the Final Fantasy VII Remake story. I think it's imperative, first off, to watch Advent Children Complete, because Advent Children Complete probably informs the story of Final Fantasy VII Remake just as much, if not more, than the original game does. Second, of course, will be to play the original game, Final Fantasy VII, the original. Those are the two most important ones. Crisis Core would probably be third. I think with Crisis Core you can get away from, there are some compilations of the cinematics. It's about a 45 or 55 minute video that is all the cinematics from Crisis Core, kind of in one format, as a story. Watching that is would probably really suffice, because Crisis Core is not a very good game, put simply. The story is great, insofar as that it really it has a ton of impact, and probably one of the most brutal endings in a game I think that I've personally witnessed. Dirge of Cerberus is, for right now, I would say not very important much at all, aside from giving you some more background information about Hojo, and a couple of other little things that are, for remakes, Remake Part 1, okay? Now, later parts of Remake will probably dip more into the Dirge of Cerberus tie-in. So I would say that's why it's the least important of the other Final Fantasy VII content to consume. But Advent Children is hugely important to the story, and we'll certainly get into that in the at the spoiler stuff at the very end of the video. So with that said, what did I think of the game? Well, I think overall, I'm going to start by giving a critical score to the game. Okay, so like if I'm looking at this game completely critically, without my love of Final Fantasy, of the series and everything like that, and just sort of judging the game based on its own merits, and all that stuff, I would say that the game is a solid 9 or 9.5. So that's what I would say. Now, personally speaking, the game is easily a 10 for me. It's in my top 5, maybe top 3 of video games all time. I think they did a just unbelievable job of bringing so much of what we remember of the original game to light, and sort of kind of representing it in this unbelievable way, graphically, musically, everything. There's a lot of really cool channels who have taken different facets of the game and have broken down different things. There's a YouTuber. His name is Alex. I'll put the video link in the description below, and he does breakdowns of the music for Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy series in general. And he did a really unbelievable breakdown of the Airbuster song. And it just really goes to show just the incredible amount of detail that went into every aspect of making this game. I would also recommend the Final Fantasy VII channel has been releasing a video log series covering the development of the game, which is really cool too, because it shows creating the sound effects and all that kind of stuff, and just the immense amount of detail that goes into making a game like this of this high of a quality. I don't know that I've really played too many games before that have a overall quality bar that's this high. Certainly nothing I've seen from Square in a long time. It's been maybe Final Fantasy X since we've seen something from Square that was firing on cylinders like this, and consistently, and considering the the current technological level that they're working with for this, and which there's a really couple of great things that to look at the future for the next installment and say, wow, this is going to really be something amazing. The next installment, as great as this game is, the next installment really, unless they really fuck things up, the next installment is going to just be that much better, because simply put, from a hardware perspective, this game is almost certainly going to be for PlayStation 5. Okay, I don't see any scenario in which they don't release the next installment on 5, because we're looking at least 1.5 to 2 years of development. I don't think, even if with some of the new comments that in the last couple of days that have come out from Nomura and Katase, I don't see them producing the game in less than a 3-year span. As much as Katase and Nakajima have been insistent on trying to get the game out quicker. And Nomura said the same thing. That they would like to get the game out quicker, but there's a balancing act, right? So if you want to produce and they didn't say whether this game was representative of a quicker development cycle or a longer development cycle. My gut tells me that this is a longer development cycle. So in the comments, there was a guidebook that was just released a couple of days ago called Final Fantasy VII Ultimania, and it's been people have been translating it because it's only available in Japanese. And there's interviews with all the different main players, primarily Nakajima, Katase, and Nomura, who are the 3 sort of gods of Final Fantasy VII. They were all part of the original game. In some cases in the same roles in the original game as they are in the remake. So a couple of interesting things, and I think the main important thing is that it seems as though whatever happens with the ending, okay, if you haven't, like I said, this part is spoiler free, if you haven't played through the end of the game, regardless of what happens in the end, they are still committed to making more or less Final Fantasy VII as we know it. Okay, they don't want to make any major changes to the game. They still want people, old fans, I assume, to be able to experience the game that they loved. But just with as anybody who's played the game has probably seen, it's there's a lot of reverence for the original source material, but there's a lot of expansion, and I think that's what we're going to see going forward. But what they said was that the intent was to they could go one of two directions. They could go with a longer chunk time of development and produce, say, 3 games, or produce less games, or they could do smaller chunks of content, producing more games, but to get them out quicker. And both Nakajima and Nomura sort of were saying that they would much rather prefer to get things out as soon as possible. So it seems to me that the direction that the major players are taking is to try and get the next installment out as quickly as possible while still maintaining the same level of quality, which probably means that what we will see is maybe not, some people are expecting that this would be divided into 3 games, and I think it's much more likely that it might be more like 5 games, and which would mean 4 more parts, and then each part taking about two years or so, give or take, of development time. I think the end result is that this is probably going to be a 10-year project. I mean, starting from now, so 10 years until we see the end of this massive undertaking, and you may well be like, holy shit, that's insane. But again, this is a non-spoiler review, and I will say that if you haven't played the original game, it makes a lot more sense when you play the original game, because the scope of the original game is massive. So what you see in this game is only a small fraction of what Final Fantasy VII really has to offer in terms of story and everything. Getting into the individual parts of the game, I'll go with each section. So first up is the music, and I think pretty much any review that you see of the game is going to be the same on this one. The music is fucking fantastic. It's probably one of the best soundtracks people have heard. Probably the best video game soundtrack of all time, honestly, because when you look at the older Final Fantasy games, most of them, the really classic ones, were composed primarily in MIDI form. So, as great as those soundtracks were, I mean, greater maybe than the Final Fantasy VII Remake soundtrack, Remake is just going to sound way better, because it's, you're using a full orchestra, you're using choirs, just unbelievable stuff that they did with the music in this game. So, I would say that this is like universally, I think everyone agrees that the music is unreal. So that's an easy one. Okay, graphics would be the next one, because graphics again is another one where it's pretty straightforward. This game has amazing graphics. Now, that being said, there are some problems graphically with this game. There were, I think, shortcuts taken. There's a little bit of laziness in terms of the level design, graphically speaking, in some areas. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at this game, it's got there are some major issues with textures. I think most reviews have probably hit upon the same thing I'm talking about, which is texture pop-ins, primarily with things that you don't notice that much, like walls, right? I would say, my guess is that Square was really up against the wire to get this game out, and so one of the things that they probably cut some corners on was pre-rendering of textures for walls and stuff like that. And so that's why you sometimes the textures don't render at all. Sometimes you get them, they pop in after a few minutes. This is indicative of, I think, of what I'm talking about. Now, the good news is that will almost certainly not be an issue in the next game because of the PlayStation 5. So I think it's important to note that the PS4's graphical capabilities are far, far, far behind. And you got to remember how old the system is, right? They're far, far behind what we're currently looking at. You got to remember when PlayStation 4 first came out. So at the time, I was working at a company that did home theater. I did consultation and design for home theater systems, right? At the time, Blu-ray players were so incredibly expensive because they had just came out. 90% of the systems that we were installing, we were putting PlayStation 4s in as Blu-ray players because the regular Blu-ray players were so damn expensive. And they weren't DVD cross-compatible where the PS4 was. So the PS4, and so, I mean, and this was like 2007, 2008. So the PS4 has been out for a long time. So those specs are way behind. Okay? And I think it's really important, unless I'm confusing the PS3 with the PS4, I have to think about that because I'm not. Is the Blu-ray PS3 didn't have Blu-ray, did it? I can't remember. But anyways, the crazy thing is when you look at the PS4, it was I mean, any way you shake it, it's an old system, and the specs on it are very low in comparison to your average gamer's computer right now. When you look at the PS5 and the specs on the PS5, it's a gigantically massive jump forward in terms of tech specs. So these new games that are going to be coming out are going to be able to literally do full renders for in-game cutscenes. Like you're not going to see like you do. You'll notice it in the game sometimes where there will be a switch from a in-game cutscene with pre-renders to a full cinematic with full renders, right? And a lot. Final Fantasy VII the remake does an amazing job of hiding most of those differences, but they are noticeable in some scenes, particularly. Most notably when it jumps from a in-game cinematic to a fully rendered cinematic is when you notice the difference. And there's some parts at the end of the game where it does that, and you notice it quite a bit. You won't have any of those problems, and you also won't have to worry about texture pop-ins because they're going to be able to you'll be able to do a lot more rendering of backgrounds rather than using map textures and stuff like that. It's going to be totally different. And the other thing that's major, and you notice it in the game, is the loading sequences, right? So I'm not talking about the little blue square loading sequence because we know what those are. Those will be gone too, by the way, for the most part. You probably will still have them occasionally, but only as a buffer to give the player a breather between chapters, right? So it'll probably be just the only loading scenes you'll have will be from chapter to chapter. In the game, they use a technique that was developed, and major props to them, by Uncharted, right? So Naughty Dog came up with this brilliant way of loading parts of the game during traversal sections where, like, you're squeezing through corridors, or you're walking on balancing on a beam or something like that. Where your character is moving very, very slowly, it allows them to render and load parts of the game in the far distance on the fly because of the time, right? So it gives them basically a buffer time. It's a great technique. A game that uses it really well that just came out is Jedi Fallen Order, which does a lot of that. It seems when you play Fallen Order that the game has almost no loading time, but that's because what little loading it is doing, it's doing in the method that I described, where it's using these sort of rest scenes where you're squeezing through corridors or ducking under a vent or things like that. All that stuff is ways for the developers to hide things that in the past would be a big old damn loading screen in the middle where you would just have to sort of wait. I remember back in the old days of the PlayStation, you would have Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a great example, right? One of my favorite games of all time. They gave you the logo in the middle of the screen, and you could sort of manipulate it and sort of twist it around and stuff. Gave you something to do while you're waiting for the game to load in different parts. So, all that stuff is going to be gone when we get into the PlayStation 5, right? And I would guess that they're probably developing. They probably built this game with PlayStation 5 already in mind. I'd be interested to see how quickly the PlayStation 5 port comes out once the PS5 is released. I imagine it's going to be very quick, because I suspect they were developing this entire remake series with the PS5 already sort of in mind. And because Sony has already said that developers have had sort of development kits for a while now, so that they could have content ready for when the PS5 launches. This is something that every console does. Whenever there's a new console coming out, they pre-ship development kits to the developers so they can get stuff ready, right? So we're going to probably see a lot of immediately after launch, you'll probably see Remake Part 1 released, and then hopefully, very quickly after, we'll get Part 2. Now, you might be saying, well, the original, the existence of Remake was confirmed in 2015, okay, and the game came out 5 years later, right? So what, Calendros, what makes you think that they're going to be able to make a game that took them 5 years initially in half that time? Well, it's easy. The hardest part of the development's actually already done, which is the core mechanics of the game system, which probably are not going to change over much from Part 1 to Part 2, and even less from Part 2 to all the parts following that, right? So Part 1's biggest, one of the things that's really interesting about this game, and this actually goes into the review, it is a very linear game, which it is the same as it is in the original game. This section of the game in the original is extremely linear, even more linear than Remake, because Remake actually gives you more freedom. And after that, the game becomes, I think, what most people think of as a Final Fantasy game, or when for people who maybe haven't played the older games and maybe have played Final Fantasy 15, if you think about Final Fantasy 15, it's similar to that, right? You have an open world, right? So the second part, they are going to have to do some work to develop the open world aspect of it. I don't think they're going to be able to get away from it. I think it's going to have to be. I've seen a lot of people debating and being like, no, it's not going to be a fully open world. I don't know. I don't see how you could do Final Fantasy VII, the subsequent parts, without it being a full open world. And it's not that hard to do. They did it with 15. They can literally graft the 15 system on, and which they've literally done with the next part of the review I'm going to get into now, which is gameplay. So this is sort of the final pillar. Like when you look at the three pillars, sound, graphics, and then actual gameplay. For Final Fantasy, there's a fourth pillar, which is story. But the third is gameplay. Now, the gameplay, again, is the one. This is another one where I think most people are in agreement. There are some exceptions on this one. I think there are some people who really don't like the combat in 7 Remake. I think that they did an incredible job with it. Honestly, it was almost an impossible task to take a game that was based on a turn-based active time battle system and make it into a modern sort of action RPG / turn-based hybrid, which is what they did. Now, they used a lot of the same systems they used in 15, and from what I'm hearing, I don't really remember. I had the game, but I didn't play it that much because it wasn't that good, which was Final Fantasy 13. Apparently, 13 used a lot of these systems and kind of really pioneered what became the system that they ended up using for Remake. So, what you have here is the sort of core battle system from Final Fantasy 15, where it's a fully real-time action combat based system. Like regular attacks square, heavy attacks triangle, where it becomes where it incorporates the aspects of Final Fantasy VII's original battle system is in the ATB. Okay, so as you're whacking stuff with your sword, whether it's a regular attack or a heavy attack, you're building up your ATB gauge. Okay, the ATB gauge allows you to use commands, and the command system basically turns the game into traditional Final Fantasy VII. When you hit X, the game goes into almost it's a slow mode, but it's insanely slow. It's almost like a pause combat, but not exactly. It's designed to mimic the original ATB system from 7, right? And does a really good job of it. So you're then able to go through the menus, pick the magic you want to use, pick the spells you want to use, pick the weapon abilities that you want to use, and then from there you can also use the directional pad to move to all the other characters. So the game really then becomes almost like the original Final Fantasy VII. In order to get ATB charges, though, you have to use the real-time aspect of the system. So that's where the two are married together. And it's really, really a wire-thin tightrope that they walk with the system. And I think they did an incredible job. Most reviews, I think, are saying the same thing, right? That really, the gameplay is great. And on some characters, more so than others, it feels really, really fantastic. I think the character that benefits the most from the system is Tifa, right? Because her fight style is so heavily based on combos and, just sort of chaining things together. It's a natural fit for a real-time combat system. And then you add in all the ATB stuff, right? So that is what makes the gameplay part of this so good. That being said, there are definitely problems, okay? Most of the problems are in design choices rather than the actual system itself. So aerial combat is very bad. Now, there's not that many aerial enemies in the game, so they probably didn't spend a lot of time on it, and it shows because it's extremely weak. Unless you have Barret in your party, it's extremely frustrating. So that's a big downside. The thing that pissed me off the most consistently throughout the game was losing my stagger gauge to boss phase transitions. So this is entirely a design choice, and it's a really shitty one. So what happens is you spend all this time staggering the boss, and you're like, yes, I get a stagger, and you hit him once, and then he goes into a phase transition, and it's all wiped out. It's so bad, and Square has got to fix that. Okay, that's like one of the biggest things, and I think the other thing it sort of plays in the same. There is a lot of cancel abilities in this game, way more than there should be. I'm okay with bosses being able to cancel certain things, but in my opinion, I don't care what boss it is, they should not be able to cancel a limit break. And there are some bosses towards the end of the game that cancel limit breaks, and it's really, really shitty. Um, the canceling of spells and abilities. If you're fighting a boss, I get it. Okay, it's I don't really have much of a problem with that. You know, in fact, if you're paying attention and you are watching the boss's mechanics, most of the time you're going to be able to avoid having your moves canceled by boss attacks. So that's not as huge of an issue as there's some stuff at the end where, like, you know, it's just, yeah, and there really should not be able to cancel limit breaks, because limit breaks are, for one thing, it's kind of like the stagger bar. You know, you spend so much time waiting for that limit to come, and you're like, yes, I finally got the limit. I can finally do some damage to this damn wall of hit points, and then it's canceled. It's really, really frustrating. The stagger gauge thing is the biggest problem. The aerial combat, I would guess that, particularly as we get into, you know, out into the open world where there's more variety of enemies, I think the aerial combat part will be fixed. Most of the issue lies in terrain, because what happens is your character can jump up and attack an enemy that's floating in the air. But sometimes they'll move out of range. There's a certain chapter in the game where you know, you're in a fixed spot, and the flying enemies can move outside of that box. And unless you have a ranged enemy in your, or ranged ally in your party, you're not going to be able to hit them. So if you don't have Aerith or Barrett, you're kind of screwed. So, and that's really the only problem. I didn't have a problem with the aerial combat outside of that one particular chapter, because most of the time you do have somebody in your party that can do aerial damage. And in most cases, it's not all aerial enemies either. It's like maybe one or two aerial enemies and then a couple ground enemies. So you can split your party tactics, and you can have your ranged people working on your aerials, and your ground damage people like Tifa and Cloud working on you know, the other ones. And of course, you can always use magic too. But particularly if you're playing in hard mode, your magic is extremely precious. We'll get into some of the hard mode stuff when we get into the middle spoiler section of this review. So that's gameplay, right? And those are the main issues with gameplay that I've ran into. Also, this, I would say this maybe lies in between gameplay and graphics design, but there's some sections of the game where, and yes, it's padding. There's a lot of padding in the game, technically padding, but most of it doesn't feel like padding. But when you're in a dungeon and you're running through the same section that it seems like over and over again, and you're asking me, did I turn myself in a circle because I swear I've been in this room before? That's bad level design, okay? And I realized that the original game had the same bad level design, but that doesn't mean that they need to keep that same bad level design going in the remake. So while I appreciate that they were trying to be true to the original design, this is one area where they do need to try and you know, raise their game a little bit. And, you know, at least make the environments for these corridor-based dungeons more different and interactive from room to room. And sometimes it's really minor things. You don't need to do a ton. It's just making different shaped rooms, making different ground clutter. And ground clutter is like a catch-all term for, like, you know, boxes or pipes or you know, like water puddles or other objects, right, that you might find. They don't even need to necessarily be interactive objects. They could just be objects on the ground. But those things are there's a mental thing that happens when you're going through those, where you're like, okay, this area feels different. This is not boring because this is not the same as the last three rooms that I was just in. So, altering the shape of the rooms, altering the ground clutter, stuff like that will fix those problems. I think that's really it for the gameplay portion. I can't think of much else that's really a problem. Those are the things that really those are the ones that really stood out. Going back into the last part of this review before we start getting into spoiler territory. Turn this down a little bit. The last portion is story. Now, this one is a little bit more of a point of conflict. I think most people would agree that the story, as it pertains to the characters, is terrific. Okay, where I think there's really a lot of divisive opinion is about the overall story of the game, particularly the ending and a couple of events that lead up into the ending. I think right up until chapter 16, the game is pretty much the same. There's really not a ton of story changes. There's a element, and we'll get into that in the spoiler discussion, that runs through the whole game it's a change, but it's a minor thing, and it only really asserts itself at a couple points in the game, so it's not really distracting until you get to some later sections. I would say that the story is just fantastic. The character work, it's amazing what they did with these characters. And I mean, for those of us who've played the game before, we all love the main characters, right? We know them. We've kind of journeyed with them before, but seeing them flesh out to the degree that they are in this game is just amazing. And part of that is an incredible group of voice talent that they came up with for this game. It's amazing. They did astounding casting work for this game. Almost all the voice actors are so on point and brought so much to the characters. A particular note is, I think, Aerith, because I think the most notable thing is that Brianna, who is a YouTuber, this was her first major gig as a voice actress, and she did an amazing job. And if anybody is interested, I highly recommend checking out her channel. It's Strange Rebel Gaming. She streams on Twitch and on YouTube, but she's fantastic. And you see, if you go and see her channel, you can see her reactions to playing as she plays through the game. It really hit her very hard when she got to the first couple parts where you meet Aerith. And it's no surprise. I can't really think of too many instances where you've had a relatively unknown voice talent have such a major role in a major AAA game like this. She did a really great job, and they all did. I mean, Barrett's voice actor has some of the most powerful moments in the game story-wise, and you would never think it from playing through the demo. You wouldn't imagine that he would really carry some of the emotional weight in some of the portions of the game, but he really does. And I love the voice actress that they chose for Tifa. I wasn't familiar with her. I knew she was in the Netflix show Glow, but I didn't know any of her voice acting work. But she did a really great job, and really, in terms of like the match in my mind for what the characters were, her and Cloud were like dead on from what I always sort of imagined in my head when as they're speaking in the original game, because of course the original game is all text. And so they really just did this terrific job, and all the side characters are great. I mean, you have a lot of, you don't really have too many big names in the voice cast. Most of them are, with the exception of Don Corneo and Johnny, are not as major voice. They're not like the same like 10 or 12 people you see in every video game that seems to come out. And Don Corneo is voiced by Fred. I forget his last name, but he's in a lot of stuff. So he's a pretty well known dude, and does an amazing job as the slimy Don Corneo. And Johnny is voiced by Yuri Lowenthal, who was of course Spider-Man. In the most recent great Spider-Man game that they put out, but he's been in a ton of other stuff. He's a pretty well-known voice actor. So I mean, there's a lot of talent there. What's really funny is when you watch the end credits and you see the additional voices section, which is like 6 paragraphs long. It's literally every major name in the voice acting, and they were all doing just random voices. Like, I mean, your big names, like your Matt Mercers and stuff, they're all in there. They were all voices in the game, just that they were doing like Undercity Resident Number 3. So, I mean, this game just they really, I think they chose the people that they thought were the best for the roles, and I think they did an amazing job. The overall story, I mean, you can't really get too much into it without going into spoilers or anything like that. So, but I would say that I think the story is amazing, and I love the ending. If you want to find out why I love the ending, you'll have to listen to the spoiler section. So, we're going to get into that in just a moment here. But I think the overall takeaway is that this game just does an incredible job. So, moving on now, and so this is, I'm going to put my hand up here, okay? If you're watching this and you don't want to be spoiled, turn the video off and come back after you beat the game, right? Because we're going to talk about spoilers now. This is going to be, this first section is going to be about spoilers as they pertain just to this game. And then a little bit later on, I'm gonna put a fist up, and that will signify, for people who've played just this game and beaten it, to stop and then come back after they've watched Advent Children and I would say Advent Children and the original game, Crisis Core to some extent, but like I said, that it's not as important. So, spoiler wise, what did I think of the ending? Boy, it's difficult to get into what I think about the ending because so much of it is actually dependent upon stuff from the original game, but more importantly from Advent Children. So I would say on a general level, I think the ending is fantastic because it sets up the possibility of things being different. Okay, it doesn't mean they're going to be different. In fact, that was why I mentioned that Ultimania guide, because it's important to note that they're not intending to make major story changes. You're still going to go to Calm, probably at the start of the next game. You're gonna go to Cosmo Canyon, right? You're gonna go to Costa del Sol. Those things I don't think are going to change. There may be some minor changes in terms of how some events play out, but I think by and large it's going to still be the same story we know, right? What they set up at the end. If you watch if you go back and use the chapter skip function, you will notice when you go to chapter 12, it explicitly says that Biggs did not die. So that was not a result. Biggs being alive at the end was not a result of your being able to alter the timeline by getting rid of the plot ghosts, and we'll call them plot ghosts because I love the term. I think was invented by Co-Carnage, but I think is just such a great name for those obnoxious little buggers. But they those you destroying the plot ghosts is not what brought Biggs back to life. I think a lot of people assumed that because of that, now you can alter the timeline, and that's why Biggs is alive. It's not the case. When you go back, like I said, and look at chapter skip, it explicitly says that Biggs was wounded, but he was not killed. They do confirm that Jessie passed, so she is dead. And people have said, that there's a glove on the desk there next to Biggs, and a headband. That's his glove and headband. That's not Jesse's. I don't think that they're trying to say anything there. As far as timelines, the only thing that's notable is Zach. Okay, so you see Zach, and what this is telling people who've never played the original game is okay, this is how Cloud gets to Midgar. Right? I think that was the intent of that scene. Now, obviously, for people who played Crisis Core, there's a whole nother layer to that, and we'll get into that in the spoiler section. But I want to call everyone's attention to one notable thing that happens, right? As Zack is getting ready to face off with the Shinra soldiers, you see a potato chip bag blow into the screen with stamp on it. But it's not the stamp that we know. It's a completely different stamp. It's a different dog, right? It's a totally different dog type. He's like a terrier or something. So that's an important thing. And I think what that was signifying is the events that we saw, obviously those had taken place in the past, but that was a different timeline. A different timeline created by us, by what we did at the end of the game, okay? Defeating these plot ghosts, okay? And that defeat of the plot ghosts allowed, different timelines to emerge. And that's what we saw. I don't think that there's any sort of... Some people are going, so now we're going to see Zack in the next game. Cloud's going to interact with him. I don't think that's the case at all. For one thing, like I said, I think it's a different timeline. I'm almost positive of that. Why else would they show that potato chip bag? Because, obviously, I don't think it's a spoiler to say, really, that this is something that was in a different, this was in one of the other Final Fantasy things. It was a part of Crisis Core. But there was no potato chip bag in Crisis Core, obviously. So why show that? It was clearly done to show that it's a different timeline. I think that it was just a little nod for the fans. Zack has a pretty devoted fan base among Final Fantasy VII fandom. So I think it was just a little nod to them, and also it shows to people who haven't experienced the original or newcomers to the series, just how Cloud ended up getting to Midgar. And also it shows a little bit about how Cloud, maybe became the way he is, right? Why he's sort of this just quiet mercenary, at the beginning of the game. And as time goes on, slowly opens up, as a person. Which is the way it is in the original, too. he was, a lot of people have asked me, in the original, was he that much of a dick? Yeah, he was that much of a dick in the original too. So it doesn't really, that hasn't changed. So, I think killing Jesse, which I think is the moment that got most people. There were two big moments in the game that I think really got most people, emotionally speaking. Those were, three, I would say. It's different for people who played the original game for the third one. The first two, I think, which were the same for everybody, was Jesse getting killed, and the second one was Barrett. After the plate comes down, you have this great moment where, and Barrett's voice actor just does an amazing job, where, Barrett's just punching the concrete wall with his one good hand, and both of those scenes, really got me. And part of the reason why the impact is so much greater for Jesse's scene is because in the original, you barely know Jessie. She's in the game for maybe 20 minutes or something like that. You don't know her that much. You haven't grown to love her as you have, in this game. And, so of course that has a ton more impact, The scene with likewise the scene with Barrett, that's in the original too, but it doesn't have the same weight because he's so upset because he thinks that all of his friends are all dead, and that impact is so much greater in the remake because of how much they built out those characters, right? We still don't know Wedge's fate, which is one of the things that does frustrate me a little bit, not knowing Wedge's fate. I think we'll get some of that. We'll find out what happened to Wedge, hopefully. I skimmed through the files to see if they mention that. The last thing I want to touch on is the 7-second thing that Sephiroth says. And I'll talk about this, and then we're going to go into the final section of the video, which is the meta spoiler section, basically, because this is going to dovetail into that. But the 7-second thing, a lot of people don't know what the 7-second thing is. If you go back in the chapter skip section and go to this final chapter, it says specifically that it's 7 seconds until the meteor hits the planet. So that is what the 7-second thing means on the surface, but there's more to it. To understand what more there is, you would have to go to the next spoiler section, which we're going to get to right now. And this last spoiler section, I'm going to hold my fist up now, okay? So if you're watching this, and you haven't played the original game, Advent Children, Crisis Core, stop, do that, and then come back and watch the rest of this. I'll be putting timestamps in the thing so people know. Okay, so the 7-second thing. The music in this game is brilliant, and it's used not just on a surface level, but storytelling. If you watch the last scene, which is that scene where, well, not the last scene, but the last scene with Sephiroth. First off, it's a mirror to the end of Final Fantasy, the original game, where Cloud is going through the wormhole, the singularity, into the edge of creation. All of that's in the original game. This is the ending cinematic for the original game. And then he faces off with Sephiroth. And down to the cuts back and forth, the staccato cuts back and forth between Sephiroth and Cloud, all of that is a one-to-one direct translation from the end of the original game. Obviously done intentionally. But there is one thing that's different, and that's the music. In the original game, the music is Sephiroth's theme, Those Chosen by the Planet. In this game, it's the Ancients theme. So the City of the Ancients theme is the theme that is playing when Aerith is killed in the original game. Now, somebody timed this. It's brilliant. So Sephiroth beats you in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that's obvious as why he beats you, because in the original game, when you face Sephiroth at the Edge of Creation, you've learned Omni Slash, and that's how you defeat him, right? Using Omni Slash, your level 5 limit break. And Sephiroth calls attention to that and says, "Not yet," right? And then after he says "not yet," he slashes Cloud's sword away, and you see the sword in the ground, which is the opening logo to the game. And then Cloud, he says to Cloud, 7 seconds to the end, what will you do? Now, there is a reference to the meteor, but it's also a reference to Aerith. More specifically to Aerith, because 7 seconds is the amount of time it took Sephiroth to fall from the ceiling, stab Aerith in the heart, and kill her. It's been timed. So 7 seconds. Now, what's important to realize is it's a double, because if Aerith doesn't die, okay, then she's not part of the life stream, and the life stream with Aerith's power cannot empower Holy to repel Meteor, and which means in 7 seconds the planet is destroyed by Meteor. So that's what Sephiroth is saying. It means two things, but really it's the same thing, because if you don't save Aerith, then you can stop Meteor. If you save Aerith, which I think the game is going to give you a choice, I really feel that they're going to give you the choice, then I think you get a bad ending. I think the world ends. I think Meteor destroys the planet. Or you have to find some other way, or you have to sacrifice somebody else. But the problem is, if you sacrifice somebody else, it's not going to help Holy defeat Meteor. So I think in the end, it comes down to Aerith or the planet. And the player will have a choice, right? And I'm sure they're going to hit on this, right? You know, I think they're going to really drive home the fact that, yes, you can choose to save Aerith, but, you know, it's gonna cost everybody. So that's the big spoiler at the end, and the big meta story. But there's more, okay? So I mentioned that this game is heavily dependent upon Advent Children. So the thing that's important to remember, there's two major things that are important to remember is, in the original game, when you see Sephiroth in Shinra headquarters, it's not Sephiroth. It's Jenova, okay? Jenova's just assuming the form of Sephiroth. Alright? And I believe that up until a certain point, that's the case here as well. And then the main thing is when you go back and look at Advent Children Complete, the three remnants of Sephiroth in Advent Children Complete, those are the three harbingers that you fight at the end. And a lot of people have said, oh, they represent Barrett, Cloud, and Tifa, because sword, gun, glove. But if you watch Advent Children, they use those same weapons. But most importantly, you have to pay attention to the abilities the monsters are using in the game. The same abilities from Advent Children. So there's no question. They're meant to be the three remnants from Advent Children. And the harbinger of fate is Genova. So at the end of the game, Genova's gone. Genova is not, and because Genova wasn't there, okay, in the original game. That's why it's important. Genova is gone, and that's why the harbinger that you see is Genova, right? But the Sephiroth that you fight at the end is Sephiroth from Advent Children. There's no doubt about it. When you look at the fight, okay, and again, you got to pay attention to the abilities. It's the abilities that he uses in Advent Children, all of them, right? Heartless Angel, Octoslash. That's all stuff from Advent Children, right? So what's happened is Sephiroth from the future, okay, is attempting to go back and fix his mistake. And what was Sephiroth's mistake? Killing Aerith. That was his mistake. Because in killing Aerith, he allows Holy to be empowered to defeat Meteor. Because Sephiroth's whole purpose is to destroy the planet so he can become all-powerful. He wants to create a wound in the planet so deep that he will be merged with the life stream and become all-powerful. That's what Sephiroth wants. And unfortunately, I think you're going to have to make that choice because Sephiroth is going to follow the original path. He believes that by taunting Cloud, because really what he's always doing is fucking with Cloud, he can convince Cloud to save Aerith for him. So that's I think for whatever reason he can't directly interfere, or he can't not kill Aerith, or maybe he can now. That's the other thing. This might be one of the other things that now is a possibility, right? He could potentially not kill Aerith now because the Whispers can't stop him, right? The Fate can't stop him. The avatars of Fate that we fought at the end was Genova attempting to preserve the timeline along with Sephiroth. But they're using the Whispers, they're using Fate to attempt to keep things along the same path. And I think that's the important thing to take away from the storyline, right? Now we have destroyed Fate, and we can break free from the set timeline. That's why at the very end it says the unknown journey will continue, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen, right? And I mean, they've said, and they've continued to say time and time again that the core of the game will be the same, but there will be surprises, there will be changes. And now, with those stupid plot ghosts gone, we don't have to worry about plot ghosts. They're free to change the storyline without any confusion about, well, wait a minute, but this isn't the way things happened in the original. It's because we destroyed the plot ghosts. The great thing about the plot ghosts is they knew how obnoxious they were. Now they've come up with a way to achieve the same result having the plot ghost has, but not even have to have them. So it was brilliant design work from the perspective of the design team, because now it gives them freedom, and they don't have to shoehorn in those stupid plot ghosts. I mean, ultimately, when you look at it, I think they really did a great job with all of that. The last thing I want to talk about is the Zack thing. So Zack in Crisis Core, obviously Zack dies. The scene where he charges the Shinra soldiers and says, "Come and get it," right? The next scene that you see is him being shot at point blank range by a bunch of Shinra guards. And then as he's dying, Cloud comes over. It hits really hard. And partly because of Aerith, but he gives the Buster Sword to Cloud. And what's really cool is you see this scene in the church with Aerith, and she looks up as it starts raining. But the one thing that's important, and I think a lot of people miss about that scene in Crisis Core, is that it's raining. The plate is there, right? It can't rain, but the rain is symbolic, and that's why at the very end, Aerith says that she misses the steel sky when it starts to rain because it reminds her of Zack. So the potato chip bag obviously was not in the original Crisis Core story. That was solely put in there by the design team to show this is a alternate reality. Zack is alive in this alternate reality with Cloud. They both survive. But it's not this reality. It's not the reality we're in right now. In our reality, Stamp is like a spotted, I don't know, like whatever dog. In this other reality, Stamp is a little terrier, So, I think, that scene, it was a nod to fans. People leading up to this were hoping that we might see something with Zack. Maybe that we would see, maybe in a cutscene, just a lead up to Cloud appearing in Midgar. Giving some context as to why Cloud is the way he is. Because what people don't understand about Cloud is that he has severe PTSD because he witnessed his friend die in a pretty terrible way, right in front of him, right before he came to Midgar. And it's why he's so closed and cut off, emotionless. He's also taken some of Zack's memories, just as a part of it is because the Genova cells that he's been infused with. Cloud was not a soldier. He was never a soldier. He was a whatchamacallit. Well, he was a Shinra guard, and you find this out in the original game in Nibelheim later. So I think they've really set things up where you can have some really cool stuff that they can do later on. But I think there's a lot of potential to open up some of these other stories. I think one of the ones that really stands out the most is, as you can open up a lot more, is Vincent's story. Because when you see Vincent in Nibelheim and he's in the coffin, you don't really get a ton of the backstory that you get in Dirge of Cerberus. And you learn, that basically all of this that happened with Vincent is because of Hojo. And you learn how much of a monster Hojo is, and I think Remake does a really great job of making Hojo seem like much more of a monster than he ever appeared to be in original, the original game. I think, but now you have the ability to bring in Lucretia into the story, and show the relationship with Hojo, and Professor Gast, I think was it Professor Gast? And then also this ties into Aerith's storyline as well. So there's a lot of really cool elements that they could explore as a result of the remake, and its sort of um, approach of expanding on smaller story elements and giving them more importance. So, so I'm gonna kind of end this by saying that I think my prediction is the next game, probably in 2 to 3 years, we will get probably a 30-ish hour game. Probably not quite as long as this one. It might be a little less expensive, maybe $50 instead of $60. And I think it's going to cover Calm and Cosmo Canyon, probably. And they have to have a climax, right? That's the other thing too. People who were critical, like, oh my God, he's fighting Sephiroth at the end of the first one. This makes no sense. I mean, come on. People need to use their heads, right? They have to have a big dramatic conclusion to the game, right? And the game is about Sephiroth and Cloud. I mean, that is apparent from the very beginning of the game. When you set foot in Chapter 2 and you see Sephiroth, it becomes apparent that, the main catalyst for the storyline is Sephiroth and Cloud. So you have to fight him, right? It's going to be interesting to see in subsequent parts how they handle the story climaxes for those individual parts, because the games do need to stand on their own, I think. And that's, I think, the thing that's important. So they need to find some appropriate climax. There are points in the story where you can end a game on that are already in the original without needing to be altered. But a large portion of them, I think, you're going to need to add something to give it more of an impact. I think the most obvious one where you can end a game on is Sephiroth's killing of Aerith. Is obviously, that's a big one that you can end. You could end a game on that one. I don't know. That would be pretty crazy to end a game on that. I mean, particularly when you figure that there are a large portion of fans who have never played the original and don't know. They're going to just be like, what? But I mean, that's fine. I think that's a good stopping point. There's a couple of other ones that are good stopping points, but I think for the most part you need to kind of embellish it. I think they could make for like the second to last game, you could make the ultimate weapon sort of the final battle for that one. There's ways that you could do that. I think that would be a good one, like a big sort of ending point. Where you fight it, and that would be good, I think. And that takes care of, I think, 3, 4, and 5. Of course, 5 we know we're going to fight. It'd be safe for Sephiroth, true Sephiroth, who is, of course, the Sephiroth that we fought here. Like I said, is Advent Children Sephiroth. Real Sephiroth is still in the Northern Crater. Okay, that's the important thing. The real Sephiroth is still in the Northern Crater. So you would still fight, Sephiroth and save for Sephiroth at in the last game. So if you figure they do the ultimate weapon for 4, and then the third one is Aerith, death. What do you do for the second one? I don't know. That's an interesting one. I don't know what you do as sort of an endpoint for the next game, unless they make it a larger game that does go up to Aerith's death, and then I think you really don't need to change too many story elements at all. So maybe that's what they'll do, but then it means a longer wait. And I feel like in my gut, I think that Square is gonna have a real sense of urgency to try and get the next part out, because there's going to be a huge demand for it. People are just going to be clamoring for it. So that's kind of what I think. We're looking at. It's just an interesting thing. It's pretty crazy. I mean, Anyways, I think that's pretty much it. This has been a long review. I knew it was going to be. We'll timestamp different parts of it. I would say everyone should play this game. It's not a game that you need. You don't need to have played Final Fantasy VII. You don't need to have really even been an RPG fan. It appeals to people who love cinematic games like Last of Us or Red Dead Redemption, but it appeals from a gameplay perspective to the people who like action type games, action type driven games with real time combat, and the hard mode is like on the level with Dark Souls, because it is tough. It is very tough. The bosses have new moves. You don't regain magic points ever. You can't use items, and when you stop at a bench, you don't gain magic points. You only gain hit points. So the only way to get magic points is to either steal it from an enemy, have MP regen materia, etc. That's so it's you really have to be smart, and I really recommend people try hard mode. If you like a difficult gaming experience, if you like Dark Souls games, really like the hard mode for this game. But I think in pretty much every aspect of the game, it appeals in some way to everybody. So a lot of people I see are reticent because of the fact that it's this long-running series. First off, every Final Fantasy game is its own game. So 10, 13, 15, all different games. Each one of them stands on its own. 7 Remake stands on its own, just like every other game in the series. It gets a deeper meaning for those of us who have played everything else. But you don't need it to appreciate it. So, yeah, that's it. I think everyone should go out and play this amazing game, and I can't wait for the next part. I hope I live to see the end of this amazing journey, because I think it's going to be something really special. So that's it. Calendros out.